Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 5th speaker series session. My name is Caitlin Corrigan, and I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Artificial Intelligence at the Technical University of Munich. We are very excited today to be hosting this event with all of you. With its speaker series, the TUM Institute for Ethics and Artificial Intelligence invites experts from all over the world to talk about ethics and governance of AI. These events serve as an important platform for sharing new research and exchanging knowledge. Since our launch, we have already been able to run 14 speaker series events. And because of these virtual events in particular, we've been able to reach an even broader audience from around the globe. So we're looking forward to hearing from all of you today during our discussion, wherever you are. Today, we are delighted to have Zuzanna Warso, Senior Research Analyst at Trilateral Research. She's a human rights lawyer and is here to talk about AI ethics, human rights, and the role of civil society organizations in ensuring responsible development of artificial intelligence. I'd like to say a few more things about our distinguished guest. Zuzanna Warso's work focuses at the intersection of science, technology, human rights, and ethics. She has been involved in several national and international interdisciplinary research and innovation projects, exploring ethics of new technology and their impact on human rights and freedom. For 10 years, she has been cooperating with human rights NGOs on these topics. So we're very excited to have her perspective here today. Just a few notes before we begin. Some event etiquette. Please turn off your microphones and cameras during the session. Please submit your questions via the chat or raise your hand function when we get to the discussion section. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible in the time we have today. Also, you can let us know in the chat if you're having some sort of technical difficulties. With that, Zuzanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And yes, so the topic of my talk is AI ethics, human rights, and the role of civil society organizations in ensuring responsible development of artificial intelligence. And I would like to start with some remarks about the terms I use, so we have a common understanding. So civil society, as we know, refers to community linked by common interests and collective activity. And civil society has also been understood as a space for collective action around shared interests, purposes, and values, generally distinct from government and commercial for-profit actors. And the role of civil society in the governance in the EU is recognized in the EU treaties. Article 11 of the Treaty on European Union stresses the need for the EU to have an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with civil society organizations, for example, when preparing proposals for EU laws. So whereas civil society in the broad sense can include all non-state actors that interact publicly and are not driven by market interests, CSOs, so civil society organizations, are characterized by a higher degree of organization continuity. They are usually formalized. So civil society organizations are non-governmental organizations, for example, but also professional associations, trade unions, etc. And civil society has been associated with this normative expectation of deliberative and participatory democracy, and the interest in civil society is connected to the idea of broader involvement of non-state actors in governance, and it has increased with the crisis of representative democracy. It's important to remember that civil society is not homogeneous. There is certainly no one civil society view. So whenever I say civil society or civil society organizations, this will inevitably be a simplification. I will refer only to selected CSOs, and it's important to remember that it's never the whole picture. So I will speak mainly about civil society organizations that have been most outspoken in the debate concerning AI and the regulation of AI. And I will focus on the EU level, on the debate that is taking place at the EU level. And as far as AI ethics is concerned, as we again all know, it's a considerably young field within applied ethics. with significant dynamics, but still few well-established definitions and axioms. And when I speak about human rights, I refer mainly to human rights law. So the body of international law designed to promote human rights on different levels of domestic, regional, and international. And for me, this also, in general, this also includes case law, for example, by the European Court of Human Rights, but also interpretations of the treaties, for example, UN treaties published by the UN treaty bodies, or the recommendations from the Council of Europe bodies. And finally, I would like to explain why I prefer to talk about responsible development of AI and not responsible AI as such. I think technology on its own cannot be responsible or irresponsible. It's rather its development and use that is responsible or irresponsible. And I find this distinction important because I think it highlights the question of accountability, which is one of the more important issues in AI ethics. So the next slide, please. A couple of words about the civil society and the ongoing AI ethics debate. So in general, civil society organizations, the big ones, the big players, so to say, in that debate, have been rather critical of the AI ethics debate, and I will try to explain why. So Europe has a tradition of strong civil society organizations having impact on policymaking. For example, in the field of environmental policies, and strong CSOs have also been present and actively engaged in the policy debate around AI. Well, and it's crucial because if Europe puts societal interests and values at the center of its approach towards AI, this requires active engagement between government and civil society. That being said, according to many CSOs as well as researchers, the AI ethics debate has largely been driven by industry and business. And there are numerous initiatives set up by business actors around AI that also are set to address social and ethical aspects of AI. And the role in these initiatives is definitely worth looking at. I will refer only to one example, which is the Partnership on AI, which is a coalition set up by the big companies: Amazon, Facebook, Google, DeepMind, Microsoft, IBM, and later joined by Apple, which is a multi-stakeholder organization bringing together representatives from different fields, so academics, researchers, civil society, organizations, companies, etc. And some CSOs have complained that the Partnership on AI did not, in fact, influence the attitude of member companies or encourage them to consult with civil society on a more systematic basis. So it was rather an ad hoc dialogue rather than something systematic. And ultimately, it led to some CSOs resigned from these from this initiative because they didn't really see a commitment from the private companies participating in it. And so for example, Access Now resigned from Partnership on AI, and another CSO, Article 19, which is a British human rights organization that focuses on freedom of expression and freedom of information, pointed out that ethical initiatives within industry are more often than not opaque to civil society, with most ethics boards and codes of conduct being developed and deliberated exclusively in-house. However, what is more surprising is that similar charges have been formulated towards the initiatives, ethical initiatives convened by governments and by EU bodies. So one significant example often recalled in this context is the high-level expert group on AI, which was a group of 52 experts bringing together, again, representatives from different fields. And it was, in this case, it was appointed by European Commission to support the implementation of the European strategy on AI. And Article 19 pointed out that when civil society is invited to partake in deliberation around ethical AI, the division of seats at the table is not equitable. For instance, during deliberation at the European High-Level Expert Group, industry was heavily represented, but academics and civil society did not enjoy the same luxury. So according to these and other CSOs, the most powerful industry actors can influence the AI ethics debate disproportionately. And even when civil society organizations are invited to these initiatives, they are outnumbered by business. Next slide, please. So what is wrong with AI ethics? Of course, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with AI ethics. It's rather about how they're being used. But one of the main charges against AI ethics, apart from this imbalance within the debate, is that it's often conceived as an alternative and an effort to avoid legally enforceable restriction of controversial technologies. So it's seen as an alternative to legal regulation. And in addition, and in this context, AI ethics have been accused of, quote unquote, having no teeth. So this means that AI ethics have no means to ensure compliance. There's a lack of accountability mechanisms. There's no enforcement mechanisms or oversight procedures, reporting requirements. In addition, there's a lack of precise and shared understanding of some crucial terms. And finally, the lack of transparency when it comes to different and numerous ethics initiatives. Next slide, please. So in light of these charges against AI ethics and AI ethics as a governance structure, many civil society organizations, but also researchers with a background in human rights, advocate the adoption of human rights-based approach towards governance of AI. And why do we need human rights-based approach? There are several reasons for that. First of all, in communities that are politically and legally committed to respecting human rights, as is Europe, through the European Union, the Council of Europe, and through respective constitutional regimes of their member states, human rights constitute common foundational principle with which the whole legal order must comply. And human rights have been referred to as the most general legal and ethical environment to deploy in order to promote and guarantee responsible advances in science and technology. And human rights have, over the years, they have proven to be able to accommodate new social and technological developments. So, for example, the European Convention of Human Rights has been referred to as a living instrument, even though it was adopted many decades ago. It has proven to be able to accommodate different scientific and technological developments over the years, with an interpretation from the European Court of Human Rights. So all regulatory challenges can be situated within a framework of this overarching standards and principles of human rights. And I think it's important to underscore that even when there is no technology-specific legislation, human rights provide a framework to address conflicts of rights, and they provide specific mechanisms and ways, methods, methodologies of balancing rights. And this has been done in the case law. This is evident in the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, for example, with the proportionality test, when the court is assessing whether an interference with a right has been justified in light of the conditions set up by the convention. And even though the convention was adopted in the 50s, we can see that it's being used and it's useful to assess cases that deal with new technologies. Only this week, the court, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights published a judgment and announced the judgment in the case of the so-called Big Brother Watch, which deals with mass surveillance, something that was completely unknown in this form when the convention was adopted. But still, the court assessed the case using the mechanisms developed in its case law, and treating convention, as I said, as a living instrument that evolves over the years. So next slide, please. But leaving aside the AI ethics initiatives led by the industry and following up on the human rights-based approach, I want to talk a bit more about how AI ethics can be saved and link the role I believe AI ethics have to play in the governance of AI. Link it with the right to participate in public affairs. So I think this is an example, one of multiple examples, when in fact AI ethics and human rights are not alternatives, but they should go hand in hand. So in this context, the right to participate is a sort of meta human right, and a right of a more procedural character, which is very relevant to the AI ethics debate initiated and run by the government, for example, in the form of setting up expert group. And it's relevant not only regarding how these initiatives should be set up and organized, but also substantially to the core of AI ethics, as the right to participate in the conduct of public affairs and political affairs, as lies at the core of questions of inclusiveness and inequality. So as far as the role of AI ethics are concerned, I would like to quote my colleagues from Trilateral. You can see that's a lengthy quote on the screen, and a reference to the specific paper where it comes from. So so my colleagues say, when they in light of and in response to those charges against AI ethics, they argue that in fact what is happening is that AI ethics and ethics in general are being misused. So let me read what they say. So it's essential to be clear here. The issue is not that ethics is asked to do something for which it is too weak or too soft. It is rather that it is asked to do something that it is not designed to do. Blaming ethics for having no teeth to ensure compliance with whatever it calls for is like blaming the fork for not cutting meat properly. This is not what it's designed to do. The objective of ethics itself is not to impose particular behaviors and to ensure these are complied with. The problem arises when it's used to do so. This is particularly evident in AI ethics, where ethical principles, norms, or requirements are called for to regulate AI and ensure that it does not harm individuals and the society at large. So instead of treating ethics as a means to govern and regulate AI and the human and corporate behavior around it, which again, ethics is not designed to do, they highlight that the real value of ethics is the constantly renewed ability to see the new as it emerges. So ethics is primarily a form of attention and continuously refreshed and agile attention to reality as it evolves. So AI ethics should according to my colleagues, and I agree with them, should need to shift attention from high-level abstract and prescriptive principles to practical contexts and relations. And in order to do that, to fulfill that role, AI ethics need to engage more with the impacted communities, especially the most vulnerable among them, and consider social and ethical impacts from their perspective. And participation and inclusion are again rooted in human rights law. According to Article 25 of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, every citizen has the right to participate in the conduct of political and public affairs, directly or through freely chosen representatives. And here I want to focus on this part on direct participation in public and political affairs. So the conduct of public affairs is a broad concept that covers all aspects of public administration and the formulation, implementation of policy. And the AI ethics debate initiated by the EU and the AI ethics debate that has some impact on the policy and on the governance is definitely a form of conducting public affairs. So therefore, rights holders should be given the opportunity to participate in shaping the agenda of decision-making processes in order to ensure that their priorities and needs are included. And rights holders, civil society, who are directly or likely to be affected by or who may have interest in a proposed plan, program, law, or policy should be identified, notified, and given the opportunity to be part of that debate. And at the moment, the right to participate in the AI ethics debate has mainly been realized through public consultation. So publishing of white papers and recently drafted legislation, draft guidelines. And as I said, this form of participation is secured in the EU treaties, Article 11, which I quoted at the beginning. However, some authors have shown that the access to EU policies by CSOs is still biased, and it tends to be European umbrella CSOs based usually in Brussels, who have a better access to EU policy making. And it has been pointed out that the access to policy processes at the EU level is still poorly regulated. It does not seem to be equally open to all. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges of the AI debate in general and AI ethics in particular, to make the debate more inclusive and to allow people to actually enjoy the right to participate. And this challenge is only partially alleviated by the participation of the big, well-organized civil society organization. So now I would like to, next slide, please, to turn the attention to the proposal of the EC regulation that was published in April as a concrete example of the involvement of the CSOs in the governance of AI and ensuring its responsible development. And I would like to again focus on those points that have been criticized in the proposal and explain why, and link it to the human rights-based approach that has been seen as the right way to go in the governance of AI. So before the proposal was published, EC examined different policy options to achieve the objective of the proposal, and ultimately it has chosen the so-called option 3+, which is a horizontal EU legislative instrument following a proportionate risk-based approach, plus codes of conduct for non-high-risk AI system. So the the proposal for the regulation follows a risk-based approach, and it differentiates between uses of AI that create an unacceptable risk, a high risk, or a low or minimal risk. And there is a trend to view the risk-based approach as an alternative to human rights-based approach. For example, in the report presented by STOA, entitled "The Impact of the GDPR on AI," it is explained that the rights-based approach to data protection views data protection as a matter of individual rights, while the risk-based approach, rather than granting individual entitlements, focuses on creating a sustainable ecology of information where harm is prevented by appropriate organizational and technological measures. And then they say that with regard to AI, both the right-based and risk-based approaches are meaningful, but the second is particularly significant. But I think this distinction between risk-based approach and rights-based approach leads to a confusion. And this has been pointed out already in 2014 by Article 29 Data Protection Working Party, who stressed that the risk-based approach is not an alternative to data protection rights and principles. So it's not an alternative to human rights based approach, and that it's that the risk-based approach is rather a means and approach to compliance. So and building on this, this human rights-based approach stresses that any deployment of AI should respect the rights to privacy, to data protection, but all other human rights as well, no matter how it's classified. So even if an AI system is classified as posing low or minimal risk, it should still comply with human rights. So the risk-based approach has been criticized also because the category of risks encompasses different risks, and it does not allow to this prioritization of risks to people's fundamental rights, human rights, and puts it in the same basket with other risks, for example, economic risks. So it would allow companies to assess their operational risks versus people's fundamental rights. And this should not be the case. It would also allow companies to, for example, downplay the risks in order to escape this these requirements that are linked with systems that pose high risk. So, and finally, also the wrong classification of a system as low risk would lead to well, the systems would fall between cracks and would again escape proper oversight. So, so this adoption of a risk-based approach is one of the main charges against the proposal for the AI regulation put forward by the Commission in April. And the second big question has to do with prohibited uses of AI. And so drawing what has been referred to as red lines. And it's generally agreed that some uses of AI are fundamentally incompatible with human rights and human dignity. And the list of prohibited practices is included in the draft of the regulation. And there are 4 categories. So the first one deals with systems that would manipulate persons through subliminal techniques beyond their consciousness. So this kind of AI system is considered as prohibited. The second category are AI systems that exploit vulnerabilities of specific vulnerable groups. Then social scoring for general purposes done by public authorities. And finally, the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems in publicly accessible spaces for the purpose of law enforcement, unless and as far as such use is strictly necessary for one of the objectives listed in the proposal. So this last point is most contested by CSOs that call for a ban on the use of biometric technologies for untargeted mass processing of special categories of personal data, and biometric data is considered special category of personal data. And so the approach that the proposal has taken towards this kind of systems has been criticized for 2 reasons. First of all, there's a range of exceptions to this prohibition that could be interpreted too broadly, and in fact contradict the whole idea of prohibiting such uses. And then it has been argued that the scope of the prohibition is too narrow, so it applies only to systems which are used for law enforcement purposes in publicly accessible spaces. So it does not apply to other public authorities, nor to those systems used by private actors. And again, here the human rights arguments and the human rights reasoning, the reasoning rooted in human rights is referred to in order to justify why this prohibition should be stricter and should not allow for such wide exceptions. So, for example, and without going further into details, one of the main risks and main interferences with human rights posed by such a system is the so-called chilling effect. So it has been argued, and it has been shown also by research, that individuals in fact refrain from engaging in certain forms of activity due to a fear of the consequences that may follow. So to put it simply, people act differently and they control their behaviors when they know they're being observed and when they know that they can be identified afterwards. So widespread use of facial recognition systems, so this biometric identification, could in fact eliminate anonymity in public spaces. And so the risk of abuse of these systems, for example, against peaceful protesters is too large, and the interference with the right to privacy and the right to equality is too severe to justify the deployment of such systems. To conclude, so the last next slide, please. Okay, these are sources. you can move the conclusion also. Okay, so I'd like to conclude by reminding that over the years it has been argued that the active participation of CSOs in policymaking at the EU level could bridge the gap between EU governance, between EU institutions and EU citizens. It could put new points on the agenda and bring in new perspectives. And the debate about AI regulation and AI ethics and the governance of AI shows that CSOs' voices are very important to balance the more techno-optimistic approach of the institutions and business. And as the debate around the draft regulation shows, civil society organizations are very good at conducting independent and critical evaluations of proposed policies. And human rights as a framework play a key role in this process. Its strength lies primarily in its universality, and the fact that it's that the human rights are legally binding and enforceable. And this allows to draw red lines and to justify why certain uses of AI should not be allowed. And I'd like to finish by referring to three groups of questions that provide a useful analytical framework for further thinking and assessing the role of CSOs in the AI debate. And these questions have been proposed by Dr. Sandra Kruger in her paper on the place of organized civil society in EU policy across different policy areas, but it's also, so she didn't speak specifically about the policy area that we're talking about right now, but these questions are useful to structure and to structure the assessment as we go along with the development of the proposal for the draft regulation. So the first set of questions has to do with access, namely the opportunity of citizens to make their ideas and interests known at some stage of the policy making. So the more specific question is, for example, whether the participation of CSOs is formal or informal, whether how CSOs are connected to the policy making, do they participate in working groups, online consultations, etc. Whether they are only consulted at the beginning of a process, of a legislative process, or whether they are engaged at the later stages of negotiating the final regulation, and whether this participation is formalized or not. The second group of questions deals with representation. So I already said that the access to EU policymaking may not be equal to everyone, and that some CSOs, because of their experience and organizational strength, have an easier access to policy making. However, the question of representation would require that a more diverse variety of actors is present, and to ensure representation, it's not enough to be present. There's also a need for actual deliberation. And finally, the third set of questions refers to accountability. And more specifically, can CSOs and can CSOs have an impact that amounts to some form of political accountability on how the process of AI governance and AI regulation is organized and carried out by institutions. And that's all from me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Zuzanna. That was really interesting. I want everyone to remember they can submit questions through the chat function, or you can also raise your hand and we'll unmute you if you have a question. I would start just going back to the EU proposed regulation and wonder during either now as it's come out or during the consultation period, was there from human rights advocates suggestions of tangible ways that human rights approach can work in Congress with the risk-based approach, or is it more an overall call to replace a risk-based approach with a human rights approach, or are there ways they can work together?
I think one of the problems is that these are seen as an alternative, which is I think some form of fundamental misunderstanding, and so the narrative is usually that the risk-based approach should be ditched and replaced with human rights-based approach. And as an example of that, often GDPR is recalled as an example of a legislation that takes this rights-based approach, because it focuses on the rights of the data subjects, the rights that the data subjects have in the course of collecting and further processing of their personal data. But even GDPR has elements of risk-based approach. It's rather, I think, right now, it's not an alternative. Focus on rights makes it more pronounced, I think, and it's then much easier. Well, first of all, it shows that the whole philosophy of the legislation starts with the individual and their rights. And then it's of course it's much easier to implement those rights, but I often like to stress that the entire EU legislation, in fact, has to be rights-based, because we have EU Charter and member states are also party to the European Convention of Human Rights. So even if the legislation doesn't necessarily talk about rights of data subjects, these rights are applicable because they are guaranteed in the Charter. So it's not that if the EC and other institutions decide to follow this risk-based approach, this doesn't mean that the rights don't apply. And I think but maybe this is the human rights lawyer in me speaking. For me, every field of law is related to human rights, and human rights apply to any kind and any area and field of law, no matter how technical it is. So I would rather see these two approaches, the rights-based approach and risk-based approach, going hand in hand. Of course, for me, it would be much better if the rights-based approach was more pronounced, and then risk-based approach was rather like as the working party said, more an approach to compliance and a way to set up concrete technical and organizational measures. But as I said, these are not alternatives.
I have another question here related to the regulation. A big issue in the new proposed regulation by the EU is that there's no process that guarantees for single users to reach out to an authority when an AI system is harming them. Do you think there will be a solution to this issue, or how big of an issue is it?
Yeah, so I think this is again related to this to the approach. So in the GDPR we have this set of rights that individuals have, and whenever their data is being processed. When we don't, if there's no similar solution in the AI regulation, every person harmed by an AI system would have to rely on other legal instruments which do exist in the domestic legal system. But of course, it would be much more challenging for the court to then assess such a case if, for example, somebody had to rely on civil law or in criminal law, and in continental legal systems to argue for that there suffered harm because of an AI system. But again, I think it's important to remember that even when we don't have a specific piece of legislation dealing with a particular technology, we still have more general legal principles and rules that do apply. So the questions of liability, of course, it becomes tricky with new technologies, because then the question is who's liable, who's accountable, is it the designer, is it the user? So these kind of questions, but I'm a bit skeptical about this often put forward, that this argument about the so-called law lag, so that the law is always behind technology and that it always needs to catch up with technology. When it comes to specific pieces of legislation dealing with particular technologies, this is indeed the case. I mean, it couldn't be otherwise. But it's not like these new technologies come into a legal vacuum, and we are completely lost, and the courts are completely lost, and lawyers don't know what to do when they don't have a piece of legislation talking about AI.
Mm-hmm. Great. Moving over to the role of civil society, what could be practical, tangible governance models to really include civil society in the debate around AI, rather than the kind of challenges that you mentioned that that civil society organizations face in the debate?
I think so this is, of course, I don't have an answer to this question, because this is a big discussion on how to design a system that allows for and guarantees enjoyment of those rights to participate, not only on paper but also in practice. And we have some examples from other areas, and interestingly, the area of environmental policy is good to look at, because this is the area where the involvement of civil society, of the public, is way more developed than in the case of technology governance. So for example, there is a specific treaty, the Aarhus Convention, which guarantees particular rights to access to information, to participation in decision making, in decisions concerning the environment. And I think we need a kind of a similar instrument to an Aarhus Convention for governing technology. And this will not be the first time when the field of technology, the policy related to technology, looks at the environmental law for inspiration, and for ideas on how to deal with new kind of challenges. Similar process has taken place with, for example, the use of precautionary principle. So something which is deeply rooted in environmental policy and environmental law. We have seen this, this transposition towards also fields of privacy, and I think so. So I think we need an Aarhus Convention for governing AI and technology in general, which would create a legally binding framework for participation. Because I think one of the problems is also, and this is often a source of frustration for civil society, that there is actually no accountability and no follow-up to the numerous consultations that are taking place. So people are asked for their opinions, but they don't see it being taken into consideration, which of course then makes people less prone to actually participate in these kind of processes. So yes, I think the environmental field has something to offer for us as an inspiration. And then again, maybe as a lawyer, and I would think in terms of how to ensure that it's institutionalized, not only an informal or a question of goodwill, or
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's a lot of precedent to look to and how it's being employed in other sectors. Follow up to that, we talk a lot, we're talking more and more in our institute and hearing generally about thinking about, I mean, most of what you've presented is about, EU regulation, kind of grand principles and higher up laws, but a lot of what we're finding is that AI is really implemented at the local level, right? And so there's this movement to think about AI localism and how it's actually being implemented. Is there a different role for CSOs to play there, or different challenges that maybe local ones would face?
Yeah, I think definitely. It's also one of the questions discussed when we talk about the role of CSOs in policymaking in general. CSOs also face the challenge of legitimacy and to what extent they actually represent their constituencies or people on the ground. So this link is also sometimes, I think, quite weak. In fact, when we talk about big civil society organizations functioning in Brussels bubble, and so I would see a big difference here with the more grassroots initiatives that start locally and deal less with these grand questions of designing the whole systems with particular challenges and communities. And I think the challenge is how to link these levels. So I think this should not be separate worlds, the Brussels and then the rest of the world, because ultimately the point should be for these concerns that are identified at the local level to feed into the what is happening in Brussels, which I don't think is always the case right now. So I definitely think that the engagement with local communities and the AI localism is very important. And it also, I think it's related to what I tried to say about the role of AI ethics. I think the role AI ethics have to play and should focus more on, rather than, again, these grand principles and creating lists of principles, which then people argue about what fairness means, what privacy means. They should pay more attention to the actual impacts on concrete people on the ground. So I think this is very, very related to how I would view the role of AI ethics in general.
Yeah, thanks. We have 2 more questions I hope we can get to. So the first, I think they're referring, so I'll phrase it, I think they're referring to the an alternative maybe to the current proposed legislation. Do you think there is a better way to address the implementation of responsibly developed, responsible AI to companies that are implementing AI right now?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I think maybe they're referring to, is there something to do right now while the proposed legislation maybe is still being debated and thought about?
Well, in terms of the legal instruments we have, I think the existing data protection legislation has a lot to do with AI and could be applied to AI systems. We have specific articles that deal with automated decision making, for example. There's also legislation on concerning transparency and reporting that I think is also important to implement. So I do, as I said, I do think that there are legal instruments that could be already used when dealing with the design and the use of AI systems. Yeah, so I would turn to the existing laws in order to maybe find solutions to deal with with what is happening right now. Of course, we don't know how long the EU regulation will be negotiated. It might take years before it's adopted, and it would be a different reality when it enters. So it definitely cannot wait until then with acting.
Great, thanks. And a final question related towards a specific set of tools. What is the present attitude towards AI-controlled weapons from the perspective of human rights?
Well, there is I haven't mentioned it before because the proposal deals with civil use and it does not deal with military use. But autonomous weapons are one of the examples of uses that should be prohibited, according to human rights advocates, because they're intrinsically violating and interfering with human rights and human dignity. So there are campaigns. So there's this campaign organization called Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which deals with these issues, and they have they're discussing and participating in the work that is carried out by the UN. And so I would recommend looking at they have great sources on their websites to explain why this kind of autonomous weapons are fundamentally not in line with human rights standards and human dignity.
Great, thank you. We have just a minute left, so I'll start wrapping up. I want to take a final moment to tell you about our upcoming events. Our next speaker series of the TUM IEAI will take place on June 17th, 2021, virtually. And I'm pleased to announce the speaker for this session will be Samira Samadi. She's the head of Human Aspects of Machine Learning Group at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems. And she'll be speaking on building more ethical machine learning for humans with the help of humans. We also have another speaker series event coming up with John Tazioulis from University of Oxford on July 15th. And of course, we have our Responsible AI Forum, which will be from December 6th to 8th at the Holiday Inn in the Munich City Center. So we hope to see you all there and see your submitted abstracts and your registration for that. Last but not least, I also want to remind you that the best way to stay up to date with our news and events is to visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. That way you will always get the latest alerts about our events coming up. And with that, I would also, of course, like to thank Zuzanna once again for accepting our invitation and joining us and giving this wonderful presentation and this really exciting discussion. So with that, I say have a nice day to everyone, and thank you once again to Zuzanna.